Welcome to Mind Yourself, a podcast sharing real-life stories from real people, alongside conversations about mental health and emotional well-being. Listener discretion is advised, as this episode may include themes some listeners may find distressing. Wherever you're joining us from, whether you're walking, driving, or taking a quiet moment for yourself, you're very welcome here. Let's get started. We now welcome Dr. James O'Shea to the Mind Yourself podcast here at Four Swans Therapy and Wellness Centre. James, or Jim as I know you are a psychotherapist, a nurse, you are chair of the Addiction Counsellors of Ireland, and you're a mindfulness teacher, and you're CEO of Mind Aware Consultancy. You're very welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Helen.
Jim, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, okay, thank you. And luckily enough, I do some work here for Four Swans in Duleek, and I'm delighted and very proud to do that. These days I work primarily as a psychotherapist. I treat trauma and PTSD. That's what I specialise in these days. I'm also involved with Mind Aware Consultancy in terms of delivering training and development for a whole range of mental health professionals. And I do some supervision for addiction workers as well.
Jim, you're here today to share your own personal story. I suppose you experienced a really profound loss in 2020 when you lost your wife, Anne-Marie, to a brain tumour. She was only 56.
That's right, yeah.
Would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about that experience and how it's shaped you?
Absolutely. I mean, it was a horrendous experience. It turned our whole family on its head. Anne-Marie had been sick for a very long time. Anne-Marie was sick for about 11 years before she died. She was diagnosed in 2009 with a brain tumour. It was a cancerous brain tumour. It was untreatable, but it was manageable over a period of time. She progressively got sicker as the years went on. Her physical health slipped a lot, and eventually in the latter years she had a lot of cognitive decline, so she had a really, really tough time, and as a family we had a really tough time as well. So we had a very long journey into Anne-Marie's death. In 2017 she was diagnosed with a recurrence of her tumour, and it was a stage 4, so it was untreatable at that stage. There was some intervention, but it was just to buy some good time really. But she progressively declined over those years, and eventually her condition became palliative in 2020, and she probably lived for about 3 months after that. So it was a very tough time, toughest of all for her, but certainly for my 2 sons and myself it was a really awful time, yeah.
What age were your sons when your wife passed away?
So when my wife passed away, my youngest son was 18 and my eldest son was 23.
Jim, did your training and your professional knowledge prepare you in any way for your loss and your grief?
It did to some extent, Helen. I think I worked in mental health services for a lot of my career. I worked in addiction services, so I was well used to dealing with distress and dealing with trauma and working with other people's distress and trauma. So it did to some extent. Also, I think having an understanding of mental health and having an understanding of the kind of things that can support people in, minding their mental health was certainly helpful to me. But I think there's a huge gap between, the professional experience of it and the lived experience of it. And I suppose when something that significant happens in your life, probably all of what you know and all of the skills you have are pretty inadequate at helping you to cope with it. I think when we were speaking earlier, I mentioned to you that the only way I could describe the experience of waking up the next day after Anne-Marie was buried was that it was like as a family we'd been in a plane crash. It was like we were living in the mangled wreckage of our lives. I remember obviously we cared for Anne-Marie at home until she died, and we had all the the kit you get from the HSE, the hospital beds and the hoists and the whole lot. So our bedroom was full of all hospital kit, and our bed was in storage. So the day after Anne-Marie's funeral, I woke up the next morning on a fold-out bed that I'd been sleeping on beside her hospital bed while we were caring for her. And I remember waking up, and obviously on a fallen bed, very close to the floor. It was August, so it shouldn't have been cold, but the whole place felt freezing. And it was just like full impact of a plane crash at that particular moment. And that continued for quite a while for all of us.
Did your understanding of grief change after you became bereaved yourself?
I suppose that's a hard question in some ways to answer, but it did to an extent. A lot was as I expected, because I and us as a family had a lot of warning, I suppose, that Anne-Marie was getting sicker and was going to die. We were able to prepare ourselves. My eldest son had gone for counselling in advance of Anne-Marie's death. I had gone for personal therapy about a year before she died. So we were doing the best we could to kind of prepare ourselves. And probably because of my profession, we knew kind of the general direction we should be going in. But the thing, I suppose, that strikes me most now as I look back is that what I didn't know at the time was that the pain and the distress and the turbulence, it felt like it would never pass. It felt like it would last forever. And as I look back 6 years later, it did pass. Grief doesn't go away, grief changes. But the awfulness and the horrors of it passed. And I suppose if I had known that then, it would have been good. Yeah.
And Jim, how did you navigate those early days when you felt like, this was never going to get better?
Antonia, it was like back to basics. It was almost being like a child. I had to take it every single step at a time. In the early weeks, and I had done this previously when Anne-Marie was first diagnosed and very sick, is I made a list of what I had to do every day, and I did it. And at the end of the day, I ticked off the list. And my, I suppose, agreement with myself is, you've done all you can for today, and I'll start again tomorrow. So that was a huge help. My Anne-Marie died at the very beginning of COVID. So my two sons were going to college online. So the three of us were at home together. So the fact that we were together, we were able to band together and kind of mind each other and support each other and look out for each other. That was a huge support, because the three of us continued to live together for a year after Anne-Marie died. But the other thing I suppose that was really helpful was that I had really, really good friends. I had a really good peer support network, and I tapped into that. I had to call people. Certainly in the first 3 months, I called friends every single day just to check in. I had friends who called me every single day. I had one very good friend in particular, PJ, and we walked almost every day together in those early days. And that just kind of, it just helped me really in the early days to stumble along, and I eventually begin to walk again, really. Yeah.
And were there any challenges in the home with you and your boys all navigating grief, possibly in different ways? Because we all have different grief styles, don't we?
Yeah, and we did. I mean, my boys were young, particularly my youngest lad, Adam, was only 18 when his mum died, and Dylan was still quite young as well. They were two young fellas, so they were possibly a little bit less likely to talk about it and share about it than I was. And if I look back on it, I was probably I was inclined to overshare my grief, because as a therapist, my view was you got to talk about this. You can't suppress this. You got to put it out there. But two young fellas weren't necessarily ready for that. I remember the first Christmas after Anne-Marie died, which was, whatever number of months after she died. I did a short video just on my phone as a way of remembering our first Christmas without Anne-Marie. And it was really to mark a point in time. And I shared it with my two boys. one of them was able to listen to it and the other has never listened to it. I think the video was really useful as a way of marking a point in time, and then looking at that now, looking backwards, you can see how much the grief has healed. Sharing it with the lads at that stage probably wasn't the best call I've ever made. I'd probably be a little bit more circumspect if I could rewind the clock.
But it's also a real challenge, isn't it? You're grieving yourself, but you're also trying to support your young sons. It's difficult.
It is.
You mentioned there that grief never disappears, but it does soften.
Yes.
What do you think that people misunderstand most about grief?
I think there's two polar opposites that people think about grief. One is that it will never go away, that it will overwhelm you. Like for me, the pain of grief was such that I felt I could die from it. Mm-hmm. It was that overwhelming. So I think sometimes people get stuck in that mode that this is never going to get better. And I think that contributes to anxiety, and it contributes to depression, and it probably contributes to traumatic grief experiences as well. But on the other pole of that, I think people sometimes think that a time will come, like going to have your appendix out, that it'll be all fine and it will go away. And that's not the truth either. For me, the truth is in the middle. Grief never goes away, but it does change over time. It does get softer. It does get less painful. It does get less disturbing. I remember thinking in the early days of getting over grief, and I don't think that properly explains it. I think getting on with grief might be a better way of seeing it, because we learn to live with it, and we learn to kind of, I suppose, integrate the grief and integrate the good and the bad times into our current lived experience. And I think for me, a lot of the healing from grief is that integration of realising that this is now part of my lived experience, and it's a very traumatic experience. And like with all traumatic memories, if I can't find a way to integrate this, it's going to continue to disturb me.
You mentioned that you have had some really good friends who've supported you in your grief. How can people support someone who is grieving without trying to fix it?
Yeah. I suppose in my experience, Helen, the best way people supported me was to be around, was just to be available, was to be at the end of the phone, and was to walk with me. I mentioned PJ earlier because myself and PJ, for the months after Anne-Marie died, we walked almost every day, and he listened to the horrors I was going through, and he never tried to fix anything. He's a good man, he's a kind man, he just listened to me. And then I have other close friends as well. There's a friend who lives the other side of the country, Brendan, and myself and Brendan would have very long conversations on the phone, and Brendan never tried to fix me either. He just listened and listened and listened, and God help him how much he had to listen, I think, sometimes. And there was another good friend of mine, Mossy, and Mossy did two things really. He did listen to me, and secondly, as time went on a bit, he created a few little distractions for me to get involved in other things. You and I worked together, our study together when we were doing our CBT trauma training, and Mossy introduced me to what we would call reclaiming life activities in PTSD treatment. He, drew me into activities, he drew me into groups, and they were the kind of things that, allowed me to build the very tiny building blocks of starting to rebuild a life without Anne-Marie. So those kind of things were very helpful, but like nobody can fix it. But I suppose the most significant thing people did was to be there and was to just listen to me. The counter of it is, I think that, and this is something that's important for people who are in grief to recognise as well, is that not everybody comes forward when you're in grief. And it's easy in the early stages of grief to be very angry with people because they go missing on you. But I suppose looking back on it, it's very difficult, and it's very, very overwhelming to be friends with somebody who's in the full throes of grief. And I think for a cohort of people that certainly acquaintances and some friends, they just weren't able to be there because it was just too distressing and just too overwhelming for them. Mm-hmm. And you have to recognise that as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that there was a point in your grieving process, a sort of shift in your relationship with grief. What was that? What was that point?
I mentioned it to you earlier. It was the 11th of August 2022. So it was a couple of days after Anne-Marie's second anniversary. And you mentioned in the introduction that I'm a mindfulness teacher. Mindfulness is very important in my life. And I came across mindfulness shortly after Anne-Marie got sick. And I think mindfulness probably saved my sanity for all of the really, really difficult years we had. So one of the things I did after Anne-Marie died, along with therapy and along with a lot of peer support, was I used my mindfulness as a way of sitting with and coming to terms with and befriending grief, really. And I really believe that, when we come across an emotional state that's so overwhelming and so awesome, there's no ducking, there's no diving, there's no avoiding, there's no suppressing. Ultimately, you have to meet it. And that's what mindfulness allowed me to do. And I have a big comfy armchair at home that only myself and my little dog really are allowed to sit on. And I was sitting doing my meditation, and I was doing a meditation from mindfulness-based cognitive therapy called a difficulties meditation. And I made a decision on that day that I would sit, or I would try to sit, with my grief. And it was probably the first time that I met the grief without the complete overwhelm, because I really had to kind of introduce myself to grief slowly and interrelationship with that, I suppose, overwhelming kind of emotional state. But I remember that day sitting in my meditation, and there was a couple of things happening. One was I knew I was in, the throes of experiencing the grief, but I also knew I was safe, and I knew it was going to be okay. And I remember directly addressing the grief in my mind's eye and saying, "You do not scare me." And in that moment, everything changed. And I suppose, again, in CBT terms or in mindfulness terms, what are you doing? You're allowing yourself to experience the feeling. You're welcoming it, you're befriending it, you're bringing compassion to it. And I fervently believe that that's what happened. I allowed myself to meet the emotion. I sat with it. I allowed my body and my mind to experience it. I befriended it. I brought compassion to myself, and the really sharp, bristly edges of it dissipated. And I suppose that's when, if you like, the recovery journey kind of escalated.
That's really powerful, Jim, because, as you know, I work with a lot of grief and loss myself, and
that's right.
We often witness people who try to outrun their grief or develop unhealthy coping mechanisms to distract from their grief. Back in 2020, in the immediate aftermath, I'm sure for you it would have been unimaginable to think that you would ever find love again or meet somebody.
Yes.
Or have a new relationship in your life, but that did happen.
Yes.
You met Madeline.
That's correct,
who's also a widow, isn't she?
That's correct.
Under very different circumstances.
That's correct, yeah.
What fears or challenges arose, I suppose, in establishing that new relationship with Madeline, given you both have a history of loss and losing your partners?
Myself and Madeline met as colleagues, because Madeline's a psychotherapist as well. And I suppose in the first instance, I didn't have any plans to meet anybody. I didn't have any plans to be in a relationship. I didn't think I could ever love anybody again. And Madeline certainly wasn't in the space for having a relationship. She had no plans. She often says her intention was to spend the rest of her life, just with her daughters, but not in a relationship. So neither of us had the intention of having a relationship. I think we were both, we were at different stages in our grief, but we were still both experiencing grief, and we were both lonely as well. That's just the reality of it. And but for me, and I know I said this earlier when we were chatting, was like in the early days when I went for a date with Madeline, I felt like I was having an affair. Like I was waiting for Anne-Marie to tap me on the shoulder and say, "What are you at?" I felt so guilty. I felt so ashamed. Not of the relationship, not of Madeline, but I felt so ashamed that I could actually spend time with another woman who wasn't Anne-Marie. So that was really, really difficult. I think another thing that was difficult for me, and I know from speaking to Madeleine, it was equally difficult for her, was like Madeleine's husband Greg was the love of her life. He was the father of her 2 children. Anne-Marie was the love of my life and the mother of my 2 children. So there was that kind of, I suppose, recognition that these were, for both of us, this was a second relationship, and I remember in the early days always being afraid of being second best, and I think Madeleine was the same. She was probably afraid of being second best, and a friend of Madeleine's put it very gently and very kindly. She said, neither of you are second best, she said, or neither of you are the second best thing, she said, but you're the next best thing. And I really like that, that Madeleine can't be with Greg, I can't be with Anne-Marie, but we can be with each other, and we're happy and we're content, and we're really good friends, and we live with that reality that there were other very, very important people in our lives. Like Madeleine still wears her engagement ring and her wedding ring. I still have my wedding ring and Anne-Marie's wedding ring together in a cross, which I wear around my neck. So we never forget that they were there. They were a very important part of our lives, but they're still an important part of our lives. Like I talk about Anne-Marie all the time with Madeleine, and she talks about Greg all the time. I do think the fact that we were both widows made that easier. When we often say that if we hadn't both had the experience of losing our partner, in terms of being widowed, it might have been much harder to kind of come to terms with that the love of this person's life is dead. Whereas because we were both in the same boat, it softened it a little bit.
And Jim, what would you say then to somebody who maybe is in a similar position, who maybe is bereaved and feels guilt or hesitation about moving forward in a new relationship?
Part of it, Antonia, honestly, is time. It really is time. I mean, it's I think in terms of recovering from any huge emotional challenge, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's addiction, whether it's grief, whatever it happens to be, there's a certain amount of healing simply in time. I'll say that again. There's a certain amount of healing in just giving it time, and it just needed a little bit of time. I suppose the thing for both of us was that we had to edge forward very slowly, and any time that we tried to speed things up, and that would have been more me than Madeleine, that it felt wobbly. So we just had to take it very easy, take it very slowly.
And between you both, you also have 4 children and
yes,
families, extended
yes,
families, in-laws.
Yes.
Was that a challenge for you as well?
It was, certainly. I mean, Madeleine's daughters, their dad had passed, when they were small. So it was obviously their dad was gone, and their mum was now with somebody else. So that was very difficult, I'm sure, for them. For my lads, Anne-Marie was far more recently. Madeleine's husband was dead probably 17 or 18 years, I think, whereas Anne-Marie was much more recent. But it was difficult for them. It was very difficult for, I think, Madeleine's 2 daughters, letting another man into their life and trusting another man in their life. For my lads, I think it was a combination of the very same. A lot of their concern was because their own grief was, still resolving, and still is resolving, to be honest. But also they were afraid that somebody was going to hurt me, or that I was going to get hurt. So there was a lot of kind of trying to protect me as well in it. Yeah.
And if anybody is listening today and they're experiencing that deep grief and despair that you've described, what would you want them to hear now to give them some hope?
I think the most important thing, Helen, I'd want them to hear is that, if you allow it to, grief always settles. Grief always softens. I was going to say pass, but I don't think pass is the right word, because that gives the impression it goes away. I mean, if you love somebody dearly, grief never goes away, but grief does soften. Like I remember in the early days being so overwhelmed that I couldn't go to the shop. I was in in Kilkenny in the town this morning, and I was walking around the town doing a bit of shopping and getting a coffee, and I felt really happy. And I didn't think I'd ever feel happy again after Anne-Marie had died. So just being able to feel happiness, being able to feel joy, being able to feel contentment, being able to work, being able to have a good relationship with my two boys, being able to have good friends, being able to look forward and see the future and be excited about the future, because I have lots of plans. I mean, I just hope I don't run out of time. Age-wise, I've got so many plans. 6 years ago, I could never have envisaged that. So if people could only get the message that grief softens and we recover and we heal and we learn to get on with it and we learn to reclaim and rebuild our lives, I think that's probably the best way that we can give ourselves hope.
Thanks very much for sharing that, Jim. That's a really important message. And finally, what do you do to mind yourself?
In the years since Anne-Marie died, I've gone for personal therapy, quite a lot of it. I have good friends. I have a good peer support network and good peer support networks around me, both in Ireland and outside of Ireland. I'm involved in lots of exciting ventures in work that I love doing. I worked in a public service agency for a long time, and I retired 3-4 years ago. I work for myself and I do what I want to do, and I do the kind of work that excites me and gives me energy and hope. So that's an important part of it. But probably the single most important thing I've done to mind myself is mindfulness. When Anne-Marie got sick, mindfulness helped me to get through it. When she died, it helped me to get through it. Mindfulness changed my life, And then I do voluntary bits and pieces as well. I'm chairperson of Addiction Council of Ireland, as you said. That's a voluntary brief, but it gives me an opportunity to give something back to one of the professions that has given me so much over the last 35 years.
Thank you so much for coming on the show,
Thank you,
Dr.
Helen.
James
Thank you, Jim.
O'Shea.
Thank you, Antonia.
That is it for today's episode of Mind Yourself. If something in this conversation has resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, because these are the conversations that matter. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the podcast, a quick rating or review really helps us to reach more people. So until next time, mind yourself.